It started with a letter taped to a fence post. A letter claiming that part of my own yard, a strip of land I'd cared for since the day I moved in, suddenly belonged to the HOA. Overnight, the quiet routine of my home turned into a battle zone of threats, warnings, and strange visits from people who had no business being on my property. And just when I thought it couldn't get more absurd, the HOA made one demand that crossed a line I couldn't ignore. So I had to ask myself, were they testing my patience or hoping I wouldn't fight back? Before any letter showed up on my fence, life on the property had a calm predictability to it. Not perfect, not glamorous, but steady in the way that makes you feel grounded. My home sat on the edge of the neighborhood. Not quite fully in the HOA's grasp, but close enough to share a boundary line. It was a modest place with a wide, uneven yard that I'd spent years shaping into something peaceful. Fruit trees, a small shed, a patch of land I kept cleared for projects. None of it fancy, but all of it mine, carved out with my own hands over time. Most days started quietly. I'd step outside in the early morning, breathing in the scent of damp soil, and listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood coming to life on the other side of the property line. Lawn mowers, kids waiting for the school bus, distant conversations drifting over freshly painted fences. It wasn't a perfect community, but it had a rhythm that felt predictable enough. And for the most part, everyone kept to themselves, except the HOA board, whose presence could be felt even if they weren't anywhere near you. I wasn't a member of the HOA. That alone made me stand out. My home predated the association, tucked just outside its jurisdiction. The board didn't like that, and I could tell. The way they stared when driving by. The way certain members paused a little too long when passing the edge of my property, as if mentally measuring what they believed should be under their control. I'd learned to ignore it. After all, you can't control what people think, but you can control what you give them power over. Still, there was always something simmering just under the surface. A sense that someone, somewhere, wasn't content with the boundary as it was drawn. It started as small signs, unfamiliar tire tracks near the fence, orange survey ribbons that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and a few too many, accidental, visits from HOA members acting like they were lost. The first few times, I brushed it off. People wander. Mistakes happen. Curiosity gets the better of some. But there was a tension in the air that didn't come from simple curiosity. It came from entitlement. The kind people will never admit to having but express in every hesitant stare, every invasive question, every subtle comment about how neighborhood standards would look so much better if the whole area was unified. They said it casually, but the implication was clear. They wanted control. All of it, whether they had the right to it or not. Despite that lingering unease, I kept focusing on my routine. I had work to do, land to maintain, and a peaceful life I intended to protect. And in those early days, there were no direct threats, no official letters, no dramatic confrontations. Just a quiet, creeping sense that someone was inching closer to a line they weren't supposed to cross. The community itself had its own vibe, the kind you only understand after living in it long enough. There were homeowners who lived in fear of the HOA's constant notices, who trimmed their lawns twice a week just in case. Others pretended not to notice the creeping authority, but never dared step out of line. And then, there were the board members, the ones with neatly pressed shirts, tight smiles, and a kind of self-appointed authority that made every rule feel more personal than practical. They liked uniformity, predictability, control. My property didn't fit into their perfect picture. And no matter how polite their conversation seemed, I could always hear the unspoken message behind their words. They wanted it, or at least wanted the power to dictate what happened on it. Still, weeks went by without anything more than vague discomfort. I worked on repairing the shed, planted new seedlings by the fence, and tried to ignore the subtle signs that something was building in the background. I didn't want trouble. I didn't even want attention. All I wanted was to live on my land and be left alone. But looking back, the clues were all there. The strange visits, the quiet measurements, the way one particular board member kept showing up just a little too close to my fence line, the hints that a bigger plan was being whispered behind closed doors. And then, just as the last leaves of early spring began scattering across the yard, the balance finally shifted. The simmering tension became something real, something written down, printed, and taped to my fence, as if the property lines they'd been dreaming about for months were already theirs. I didn't know it at that moment, but that letter was only the beginning. The HOA had moved from observation to action, and they had no idea how far I was willing to go to keep what belonged to me. The letter on my fence wasn't long, but it carried the weight of something much larger, a declaration packaged in the polite language HOAs love to hide behind. According to them, part of my property, specifically a strip of land running along the fence line, was improperly maintained HOA-owned common space. They claimed it belonged to the association, that my upkeep was unauthorized, and that I needed to remove my shed, cut down the fruit trees, and restore the land to compliant condition. It read like someone had taken a deep breath, filled themselves with confidence they hadn't earned, and decided to rewrite history. They didn't ask. They didn't question. They asserted. The kind of boldness that only comes from believing they wouldn't be challenged. I reread the letter twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. My deed was clear. My boundary markers were clear. My ownership wasn't up for debate. And yet, paper in hand, the HOA was acting like they had every right to carve up my land and claim it as part of their perfectly curated domain. But it wasn't just the claim that bothered me. It was the tone. Self-assured. Final. As if a decision had already been made and my role was simply to comply. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked the property line, tracing the edges I knew like the back of my hand. The fence posts, the markers, the contours of the land. I'd been on this property long before the HOA gained the slightest interest in anything beyond its original boundaries. And yet, somehow, conveniently, their sudden expansion attempt aligned perfectly with their dreams of unified aesthetics. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone on the board had misread a map, or maybe a new board member had gotten overexcited. But those illusions faded quickly when, 2 days later, a second letter appeared. This one slipped under my door. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. They demanded access to the disputed land for an inspection, claiming I was preventing the HOA from maintaining their property. They threatened fines, legal action, enforcement measures. That last phrase lingered in my mind, sour and heavy. I still didn't respond. Not because I was ignoring them, but because the shift in their behavior told me something more calculated was happening. They weren't confused. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I pushed back. And when the next move came, it confirmed exactly that. One morning, I stepped outside to find 3 HOA board members standing on the edge of my property. Clipboards. Cameras. 2 of them whispering. One of them The same man who'd been eyeing my fence line for weeks. Walking my boundary as if he owned the place. They didn't greet me. They didn't even pretend to be cordial. They just documented everything they could: the shed, the trees, the land I'd cleared, every detail recorded with quiet, predatory efficiency. And then the man in front, narrow eyes, smug stance, spoke without breaking stride. He said they'd be back with the landscapers. No explanation. No legal support. Just a threat wrapped in a casual tone that made my jaw clench. I didn't react in anger. Instead, I watched. Memorizing the confidence in their walk, the certainty in their posture. They weren't working off assumption. They believed they had already won. But they weren't expecting resistance. They certainly weren't expecting preparation. The next day, a notice was taped to my front gate claiming I was obstructing HOA duties, and that fines would accumulate daily until I allowed them access. It listed a fine amount that started at absurd and climbed to ridiculous. They attached photos they had taken, drawing red circles around the shed and fruit trees, as if marking contraband. I could feel something shifting in the neighborhood after that. Neighbors who used to offer polite waves now kept their distance. Some looked concerned, others looked curious. A few, especially the ones the HOA favored, watched with the self-satisfied interest of people expecting drama they wouldn't have to be responsible for. A week passed, and each day the threats increased. More letters, more warnings, more claims that the HOA would take action, with or without my cooperation. They cited bylaws, none of which applied to me. They demanded access. They accused me of damaging common space. They hinted at legal escalation. And then one morning, the inevitable happened. I heard engines. Multiple. I stepped outside to find a landscaping crew parked beside the property line, unloading equipment, like they were preparing for a demolition. The HOA board members stood nearby, arms folded, talking with the confidence of people who believed everything was already signed, sealed, and decided. They were ready to tear down the shed, cut down the trees, rip apart the land I'd worked so hard to cultivate. They truly thought I would roll over. But as the crew approached the fence, ready to cut through it, I stepped directly into their path. Calm, centered, and ready. The landscapers hesitated. They weren't the problem, they were just hired help. But the board members, their faces tightened, their self-assured smirks fading into something colder. One of them demanded I step aside. Another said I was interfering with property maintenance. The third, my favorite, said I was risking additional fines. I didn't move. Instead, I told them something they clearly hadn't expected to hear. That the land they were claiming wasn't theirs. That my deed was clear. That they were attempting unauthorized entry. And that continuing forward would be trespassing. Their reaction was almost comical. Bewildered indignation. As if the script they'd written didn't include this response. The landscapers backed off, unsure. But the HOA. Their confidence cracked, but only slightly. They sputtered something about official documentation and boundary clarification. But the weak tone said everything. They weren't certain. They were bluffing. But their next actions shifted the situation from annoying to dangerous. Over the next couple of weeks, they doubled down. More board members appeared near my property. More photos were taken. More neighbors were dragged into the rumor mill. I heard whispers about disputed land and removal orders. I even heard one board member brag that the HOA would on the whole block soon. They posted a final warning on my door claiming they had scheduled a forced removal of unauthorized structures of vegetation. They set a date, a time, They weren't asking anymore, they were taking. And that was the moment everything changed. Because I wasn't done preparing. While they had spent their time posturing and issuing threats, I had been gathering what they never expected: evidence, records, history, and most importantly, professional backup. The day before their scheduled removal, a truck pulled up to my property. Not the landscaper's truck. Not the HOA board's parade of SUVs. This one carried a licensed surveyor. He stepped out, tools in hand, ready to walk the property line with the kind of precision no HOA roomer or clipboard could compete with. I had hired him quietly, discreetly, and now, he was here to do what the HOA had assumed I wouldn't dare attempt: prove them wrong with legal boundaries instead of emotional arguments. As he began marking the land, placing flags and taking measurements, I watched the HOA president drive by slowly. His face shifted from curiosity to alarm to something far more satisfying: fear. He didn't stop. He didn't approach. But his reaction told me everything I needed to know. The HOA wasn't confident. They were overreaching. And now someone had called their bluff. But the real turning point came later that afternoon, when a second car pulled into my driveway. A sedan carrying someone the HOA absolutely wasn't expecting: my lawyer. A lawyer who specialized in property disputes. A lawyer who had spent the last week reviewing every letter, every photo, every false claim the HOA had made. A lawyer who was far more familiar with property rights than the self-appointed land conquerors patrolling my fence line. The moment the HOA realized I wasn't isolated, wasn't confused, and definitely wasn't powerless, the entire tone of the conflict shifted. Their confidence cracked deeper. Their visits slowed. Their threats softened. But they didn't back down. Not yet. They still tried to place blame. They still tried to assert ownership. They still tried to pressure with fines and deadlines and carefully worded legal-sounding nonsense meant to intimidate. But by then, they weren't dealing with a single homeowner. They thought they could steamroll. They were dealing with someone who had the evidence, the documentation, the support, and the will to fight them on every inch of the land they were trying to claim. As the surveyor finished marking the final boundary line, one that placed every disputed inch firmly on my property, it became clear that the HOA's plan was crumbling. But they weren't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. There was one more confrontation coming. One final attempt to regain control. And the moment it happened, everything the HOA had tried to build, the threats, the confidence, the power, would come crashing down in front of the entire community. The only question left was whether they would retreat quietly, or humiliate themselves trying to win a battle they had already lost. Because either way, the climax was coming, and the HOA had no idea just how far out of their depth they were about to be exposed. The HOA scheduled their forced removal for a Saturday morning, cleverly timed for maximum visibility. Weekends were when the neighborhood emerged. Walking dogs, jogging, cleaning cars. It wasn't just a removal, it was a performance. A public display of authority. A warning to anyone else who might dare challenge them. By sunrise, people were already gathering along the sidewalk. Some tried to pretend they weren't watching, but their glances kept drifting toward my property. Others didn't bother hiding it. The HOA board showed up first, dressed in their pressed neighborhood police uniforms, collared shirts with embroidered logos, clipboards tucked under their arms, and postures that screamed self-importance. Their president stood in front with open arrogance, as if he'd already won. Behind them, once again, came the landscaping crew. Chainsaws, clippers, tools meant to reshape land, my land, into whatever the HOA believed it should be. They walked with the uneasy obedience of people holding jobs they couldn't afford to lose. The HOA president cleared his throat loudly, ensuring everyone heard him. He announced that they were executing rights over common property improperly occupied by a resident who refuses compliance. His voice grew louder with each word, feeding off the crowd. To them, this wasn't a boundary dispute. It was a spectacle. And the HOA was determined to make me the villain in their show. But I wasn't standing alone on my porch. I was standing beside the surveyor. Clipboard in hand, boundary markers still scattered across the grass. And beside him stood my lawyer, calm and collected, dressed in a way that contrasted beautifully with the HOA's pretend professionalism. I didn't speak first. I wanted them to make the opening move, loudly, confidently, disastrously. The president signaled the landscapers to approach my fence. And that was the moment my lawyer stepped forward. She didn't yell. She didn't posture. Her voice was calm, but carried the kind of weight that cut through noise and ego effortlessly. She stated, clearly and confidently, that any attempt to enter the property would constitute trespassing. That the HOA had no legal claim to the land. That the surveyor's report had confirmed the boundary markers. That the HOA had issued unlawful threats, attempted unauthorized entry, and made fraudulent claims of ownership. The board president laughed, as if her words were nothing more than dramatic flair. He said, loudly enough for the onlookers to hear, that the HOA operated above individual interpretation, and that their authority superseded private confusion. He gestured to the landscapers again. But my lawyer wasn't done. She pulled out a printed copy of the survey report, signed, dated, notarized, and held it up for everyone to see. She explained that the property line hadn't shifted in decades. That the land the HOA claimed had never been part of their jurisdiction. That they had misrepresented bylaws, fabricated claims, and attempted to enforce rules over a property they had no legal authority to regulate. The HOA president's smirk faltered. But the real blow came when the surveyor stepped forward and handed him an official notice. The results of the survey had already been filed. The report was public record. Any attempt to override those boundaries would not only be trespassing, it would be criminal. Still, he kept pushing. He insisted the HOA had documentation, too. So my lawyer, with perfect calm, invited him to present it. He froze. Because he didn't have documentation. He had assumptions. He had arrogance. He had the quiet belief that no one would ever challenge him, but he didn't have evidence. The crowd began shifting. Murmurs, whispered questions, doubt, suspicion. Their confidence in the HOA wasn't collapsing yet. But fractures were showing. The president panicked, and like anyone cornered by their own lies, he doubled down. He marched to the landscapers, put a hand on one of their shoulders, and said that they had permission to begin. And that was when my lawyer delivered the blow that ended the HOA's performance. She handed him a cease and desist letter, one prepared days earlier, anticipating exactly this moment. A letter outlining the HOA's violations, the legal repercussions they faced, and the personal liability the board members could be held under if they continued. Personal liability. The phrase rippled through the crowd like electricity. Suddenly the board members, who had been standing tall and proud just minutes earlier, began shifting uncomfortably. One looked at the letter over the president's shoulder, another stepped back as if quietly detaching himself from the confrontation. Their expressions shifted from smug superiority to dawning panic. The landscapers stepped away immediately. Not one of them was willing to risk charges. Their tools went still. their engines turned off. They looked at the HOA president, who had now lost every bit of the authority he thought he commanded. He tried to bark orders, but the landscapers refused to move. One even shook his head and backed away. That should have been the end of it, but the HOA president, red-faced, sweating, desperate, did something so bold, so disastrously stupid, that it sealed his fate. He stepped toward my fence, grabbed the top rail with both hands, and attempted to climb it. For a moment, the crowd gasped. Even the board members looked horrified. And that was the moment the sheriff's vehicle turned the corner. It wasn't a coincidence. My lawyer had called them in advance to stand by in case the HOA attempted forced entry. The deputy stepped out slowly, watching as the HOA president froze mid-climb, one leg awkwardly perched on the fence. The deputy asked what was happening. The lawyer explained. The surveyor showed his documentation. The HOA president tried to twist the story, claiming he was reclaiming common property. But the deputy cut him off with a simple request: proof. Real proof. The president stuttered, fumbled, tried flipping through his clipboard, as if documentation would magically appear in the stack of forms and notices he'd written himself. Nothing he pulled out showed ownership. Nothing referenced my property. Nothing supported anything he had claimed. The crowd went silent. The deputy stepped closer, looked him dead in the eyes, and told him plainly that if he set 1 foot on my land, he would be arrested. The HOA president stepped down from the fence. The arrogance drained out of him like air escaping a punctured balloon. The deputy instructed the landscapers to leave, told the board members to disperse, and warned the HOA president that any further attempt to enter the property would be treated as criminal trespassing. The show was over. The audience wasn't impressed. The HOA president, once so proud and loud, now stood trembling with rage and humiliation as neighbors whispered all around him. His authority, once unquestioned, had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. But the climax hadn't fully hit yet. Because as the deputy walked back toward his car, the surveyor approached the HOA board and delivered one final revelation. A document detailing the exact measurement of the HOA's property, and how their boundary actually fell short of what they'd believed for years. In other words, not only did they not own my land, they owned less than they claimed. It stunned them. Shock rippled through the board. One member even whispered, "Then what have we been enforcing?" The community heard it. The president heard it. And he knew, right in front of the people he sought to impress, that he had exposed not only his own ignorance, but the HOA's complete lack of control over something they'd been pretending to govern for years. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He had lost, publicly, legally, completely. I watched him take a shaky step backward, his face twisted with the realization that he had not just failed, he had spiraled the HOA into a crisis that would unravel everything they'd been doing behind closed doors. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, one thought settled heavily over the neighborhood. This wasn't over for the HOA. This was the beginning of consequences they had never prepared for. Because now everyone wanted answers. And they were looking directly at the people who had abused their power the most. When the sheriff's vehicle rolled away, leaving a shaken HOA board and a rattled neighborhood behind, the air around my property felt different. Lighter, but charged. The kind of atmosphere that follows a storm when everyone steps outside to assess what survived, and what didn't. The HOA president retreated quickly, muttering something about reviewing documentation. But no one followed him. For the first time since their campaign had started, the board members were walking alone. My lawyer and the surveyor stayed a little longer, reviewing paperwork, making sure copies were secured, and outlining the next steps. Not steps I had to take, but steps I could take. The difference was important. The HOA had tried to strip me of choice. Now, I had all of it back, and more. As the crowd dispersed and neighbors drifted back to their homes, they carried the spectacle with them. Word spread faster than any official notice ever had. Phones came out. Messages were exchanged. People who'd previously kept quiet under the HOA's thumb now had something they hadn't felt in years: leverage. But I wasn't thinking about revenge, not yet. My focus was on securing the land, stabilizing the situation, and making sure nothing like this would ever happen again. With the surveyor's measurements filed, the lawyer's documentation in hand, and the sheriff's warning still ringing in everyone's ears, I finally closed my gate and stepped back into the peaceful space the HOA had tried so desperately to claim. For the first time in weeks, the land actually felt like mine again. The following week was surprisingly quiet. Not a single HOA member came near my property. No letters, no threats, no landscapers. The absence was almost eerie, an echo of their usual activity, replaced by silence thick enough to feel intentional. But the rest of the neighborhood wasn't quiet. People started approaching me, not aggressively, not warily, but with an almost apologetic curiosity. Some came to ask what really happened. Others simply wanted to share their own stories, things they'd endured at the hands of the HOA, but had been too afraid to speak up about. Hushed fines, strange inspections, sudden rule changes, selective enforcement. All of it painted the same picture: the HOA had been operating unchecked for far too long. One neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 streets over, told me she'd been fined for her garden not fitting the aesthetic guidelines, even though there were no such guidelines in the bylaws. Another man mentioned he'd been pressured to repaint his house twice in 1 year because a board member didn't like the shade. Someone else admitted the HOA had tried to charge them for trimming trees that didn't even sit on their property. The more people talked, the clearer it became. My situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem, one that had gone unchallenged because everyone assumed the HOA held all the power. But now, the illusion had cracked, and when an illusion cracks, people stop pretending. About 10 days after the confrontation, the HOA finally broke their silence. They scheduled an emergency community meeting, which was as transparent a panic move as I'd ever seen. The announcement was worded carefully, loaded with vague phrases like clarifying recent misunderstandings and reaffirming organizational boundaries. But everyone understood the real reason. They were in trouble, and they knew it. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a place I rarely visited, and by the time I arrived, it was already packed. People lined the walls. Chairs filled every corner. Even those who usually avoided HOA politics came to witness whatever fallout was about to unfold. The HOA board sat at the front, stiff and visibly strained. The president looked pale, his bravado gone, replaced by the exhausted look of someone who had spent the last few days trying and failing to put out a fire he started. The other board members avoided eye contact, flipping through their binders with trembling hands. When the meeting officially began, the president attempted to take control. He cleared his throat, adjusted his papers, and began speaking in a rehearsed, overly formal tone about recent events. He framed it as a miscommunication, a technical misunderstanding, a boundary dispute arising from outdated records. But the room didn't buy it. People weren't nodding politely. They weren't silent. They weren't receptive. Instead, they exchanged looks, skeptical, irritated, fed up. Then someone in the back spoke up, asking why the HOA had threatened fines before confirming ownership. Another person asked why they tried to tear down my shed without legal approval. A third demanded to see the documentation the HOA claimed to have. The questions grew louder, sharper, more insistent. The board tried to deflect, redirect, or drown out the voices. But the crowd wasn't letting them escape responsibility. And then, the moment the HOA had dreaded arrived. My lawyer stood. She introduced herself calmly, reminded everyone she represented me, and clarified exactly what had happened. Point by point, detail by detail. She presented the survey results. She outlined the HOA's false claims. She described the attempted forced removal. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She simply delivered the facts, and the facts alone were devastating. The room erupted. People demanded answers. People demanded accountability. People demanded resignations. The HOA president tried to salvage the situation, but the more he talked, the worse it got. Every attempt to minimize what happened only made the crowd angrier. Every excuse he offered only made their actions more obvious. Finally, a board member, one of the quieter ones, stood and confessed that they had never actually verified the property boundaries. They had relied on assumptions passed down from previous boards. They admitted the dispute was mishandled. They admitted the enforcement attempts were inappropriate. The president glared at him, but it was too late. The confession had broken the last thread of authority he was clinging to. People began calling for a vote. Within minutes, the meeting transformed from an attempted cover up into a full-scale reckoning. The board tried to delay it, but the neighborhood was done waiting. Several residents cited bylaws that allowed members to petition for leadership review. Others demanded immediate action. And then, with a show of hands so overwhelming the board couldn't deny it, the community voted on the spot to remove the HOA president from his position. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, slow, public. He didn't fight it. He didn't argue. He simply gathered his papers, bowed his head, and walked out of the clubhouse through a wave of murmurs and disapproving stares. A man who once strutted through the neighborhood with unchecked power now left a room he no longer controlled. The remaining board members weren't spared either. They faced pressure to resign, with several stepping down voluntarily in the following weeks. Replacements were elected. People the community trusted, not the ones who craved authority. It was the closest thing to justice some residents had experienced in years. In the days following the meeting, the atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted again. Not in fear, not in conflict. In relief. People began reclaiming things the HOA had unfairly restricted, small things at first. A garden decoration here, a slightly bold house color there, more natural landscaping choices, more individuality, more life. The new board temporarily halted all enforcement actions until they could review, and in some cases rewrite, the bylaws. Many of the arbitrary rules the previous board had created were scrapped entirely. And as for my land, my lawyer made sure the HOA officially, formally, and permanently acknowledged that they had no claim to it. A written statement was filed, signed, notarized, and distributed to every address in the community. It wasn't just an apology, it was a record, a safeguard, a guarantee that no future board could repeat their attempt. A few neighbors stopped by to congratulate me. Some offered help restoring the shed area the HOA had tried to target. Others simply thanked me for standing up, because my fight had freed them from years of silent frustration. But the moment that stayed with me most was when that older woman, the one pressured over her garden, walked up quietly and said, "For the first time in a long time, I feel like this is our neighborhood again." Life returned to normal slowly, almost cautiously, as if everyone was waiting for another shoe to drop. But the HOA didn't bother me again. They couldn't. They knew better. They knew the consequences. They knew the community was watching. My land remained untouched, peaceful mine. Sometimes I'd stand near the fence line, where everything began, and think of how easily this story could have ended differently. If I hadn't questioned the letters. If I hadn't hired the surveyor. If I hadn't stood my ground. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the principle. The right to live without being bullied by people who mistake authority for ownership. The HOA tried to claim a strip of my property. But what they really lost was the control they'd been abusing for years. Their power didn't collapse in a courtroom. It collapsed in the hearts and minds of the people they were supposed to serve. Looking back, I realized something important. Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of wood or metal. They're built from boundaries you refuse to let anyone cross. So if you ever find yourself facing someone who believes they're entitled to what's yours, someone who pushes, threatens, or intimidates, someone who assumes you'll surrender because it's easier than fighting back, ask yourself one question. What happens when the person they underestimated finally decides they've had enough? Because in my case, it changed everything. The HOA tried claiming part of my farm. They didn't expect me to bring a surveyor and a lawyer. The HOA tried to claim part of a homeowner's land. But they never expected him to fight back with a surveyor, a lawyer, and a community ready to expose every lie. Watch as this quiet neighborhood turns into a battlefield of power, pride, and pure chaos. Don't miss a second of this unfolding drama. Watch now, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life HOA stories. Feho stories, Fe neighborhood drama, Fe revenge story, Fe property rights, Storytime.